The room was silent, but the absence felt heavier than words. My dress hung on the chair untouched, the invitations scattered across the floor like fragile paper ghosts. They weren't coming. Not my parents. Not even a call to explain, just cold absence, a void that made the walls seem smaller, the air thicker. I watched my husband scroll through messages, pretending calm, but his eyes flickered. Hesitation, guilt, something unsaid. Everyone else had arrived. Friends, colleagues, the cameras set to capture every moment. They expected a perfect wedding. They wouldn't see the fracture forming, the quiet betrayal layering over our day. No one suspected how carefully I was already noticing, recording, understanding. The morning sunlight came through the curtains in soft, uneven patches. I sat at the edge of the bed, waiting for the hum of the day to arrive. My husband was already in the kitchen, his back to me as he moved slowly between the counter and the stove. I could hear the faint clink of a spoon against a mug, the whisper of water running. It was ordinary, almost mundane, but there was comfort in the ordinary. I liked observing it, liked noticing the little rhythms that no one else seemed to care about. Our home was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, measured. Everything had its place. The books lined up on the shelves in order of height, the cutlery in perfect symmetry, the soft hum of the air conditioner in the background. I liked it like that. It allowed me to see more clearly, to understand patterns others missed. Patterns that mattered, though I didn't always know why yet. I moved through the morning slowly, quietly. My husband glanced at me, then at the coffee, then back at the stovetop, a soft nod acknowledging my presence without breaking the flow of whatever he was doing. We spoke in fragments, small exchanges about the day ahead, appointments, errands, and nothing more. Nothing that needed to be weighed, nothing that demanded attention beyond the surface. There was trust in it, the kind that comes from years of routine and observation. Later, my parents arrived to help with final wedding arrangements. I didn't expect excitement or warmth, only consistency. They were polite, formal, their smiles measured. I noticed the tightness around their eyes, the way their hands hovered over furniture as if seeking stability. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. I had learned that observing quietly was often more effective than speaking. Their gestures, the small slips of expression, would tell me more than words ever could. We moved through the day like this, a choreography of small gestures and muted acknowledgement. My husband checked messages on his phone, his fingers moving quickly, yet he kept his attention balanced between tasks and me. I appreciated that. It was a subtle care, a quiet awareness that I could trust without needing to demand it. The little acts of noticing, the coffee made just right, the way the newspaper was placed beside my seat, were small affirmations of connection. By mid-afternoon, the house had taken on the weight of preparation. Invitations laid out on the dining table, floral arrangements waiting in their vases, cameras set in corners to capture moments no one would ever see firsthand. I walked slowly among these things, adjusting a ribbon here, straightening a photograph there. Each movement was deliberate. I liked to leave things orderly, predictable. There was a subtle power in that, control over small systems while larger ones moved unpredictably around me. I caught a glimpse of my mother standing near the doorway, her posture rigid, her expression distant. I offered a polite smile, and she returned it, though it didn't reach her eyes. I didn't feel slighted. I noted it. I cataloged it. Every detail mattered, even when it seemed insignificant. By evening, my husband and I sat together in the living room, the quiet between us heavy but comfortable. The day had unfolded without incident, without challenge. Trust had been maintained, routines observed, and small affirmations exchanged. I felt grounded in it, wrapped in the ordinary that felt, for the moment, reliable. I was unaware then that the cracks had already begun to form, not in the routines, not in the small gestures, but in the intentions hidden beneath them. I couldn't yet see the quiet undermining that would ripple through our lives, the subtle betrayals lurking in conversations, messages, and moments that seemed too fleeting to matter. I only knew that I trusted. I only knew that I observed. And for now, that was enough. The evening ended with the house dim, the air thick with anticipation of the days to come. I carried a sense of calm, a belief that the familiar could withstand the unknown. I didn't suspect that trust, once assumed, could be so easily broken, that the people closest to me could be quietly orchestrating its undoing. I simply sat, silently, waiting, watching, noting, letting the world move around me while I held the center of my own small universe. The days after that quiet morning passed with the same rhythm, but something had shifted. I noticed it in small details first, almost imperceptibly. The way my mother's smile faltered when my father mentioned the wedding, the hesitation in my husband's voice when he answered certain questions. I told myself it was nothing, overthinking, a trick of perception. But the seed of unease had been planted. I found myself watching more closely. I caught my mother glancing at her phone during conversations, her eyes flicking over the screen with a subtle urgency, as though she were waiting for someone else's approval before responding. I noted the way my father lingered near the door, a faint restlessness in his posture, the stiffness in his shoulders. Nothing was overt, nothing screamed warning. It was all in fragments, small misalignments that a casual observer might dismiss. One evening, while helping with seating arrangements, I noticed a folded envelope tucked under the tablecloth. I picked it up and glanced inside. An invitation I didn't recognize, addressed to my parents from some gala I hadn't heard them mention. It was polite, formal, but the timing felt deliberate. I felt a quiet knot tighten in my stomach. I placed it back without a word, choosing restraint. I wasn't ready to confront, not yet. Observation came first. At home, my husband's behavior carried the same subtle inconsistencies. He would answer a question, then retract or clarify in a way that didn't quite match the first response. Messages he received would sometimes go unanswered, or he would excuse himself abruptly, leaving me to wonder about the gaps. I felt the familiar pull to trust him, to assume that the explanations were harmless. Yet the discomfort lingered, a soft pressure at the edges of my awareness. Even friends began to offer small, offhand remarks that caught my attention. "Your parents seemed distant," one would say, a casual tone that masked a quiet concern. I smiled politely, dismissing it as nothing, even though a small part of me cataloged it, stored it for later reflection. I was careful, always careful, noting the friction between appearances and underlying reality. The first moments of direct tension were quiet, almost invisible. At dinner, my mother mentioned the gala again, offhand, as if it were unimportant, her words slipping into the conversation like water into sand. I asked a simple question about timing, and she hesitated, then answered vaguely, brushing it off with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. My father nodded along without comment. The room held a weight I couldn't yet name, a subtle tightening that made the walls feel narrower. I spent that night alone, tracing patterns in my mind. I reviewed the day in detail. The misplaced envelope, the fleeting hesitation in conversation, the flicker of avoidance. Each fragment felt inconsequential on its own, but together they formed a quiet pattern. I wasn't angry, yet, but I was alert, waiting for clarity. Restraint guided me. I did confront. I didn't accuse. I recorded silently, aware of the small but persistent dissonance. Over the next few days, these micro moments continued. A call from my father would go unanswered until hours later. My husband would smile politely, yet I could sense a tension under the surface, subtle but consistent. Even the household routines began to feel slightly off-kilter. The way furniture seemed slightly moved, the way conversations sidestepped certain topics. The ordinary comfort I had relied upon was fraying at the edges, almost imperceptibly. I began to test these boundaries quietly. I asked questions in casual tones, gauged reactions, observed micro-expressions. My parents' politeness never faltered, but the stiffness beneath it did. My husband's responses remained measured, but the faint shadow in his eyes betrayed him, if only for a moment. I didn't act on these observations. I simply catalogued, trusted my instincts, and waited. The unease settled over me like a low fog. I carried on with the wedding preparations, maintained appearances, kept my calm, but my awareness had deepened. The world no longer felt completely safe or reliable. Trust, once unquestioned, had begun to fracture quietly, leaving space for doubt, for observation, for the slow, careful recognition that things were not as they seemed. By the end of the week, the first seeds of suspicion had taken root, though I didn't yet name them. I moved through the house with a sharper attention, noting what was said, what was avoided, what lingered in the air unsaid. My calm exterior remained intact, but beneath it, the quiet tension grew, a fragile awareness that the world I trusted was already shifting around me. It started with the inconsistencies, small things that could have been dismissed if I wasn't paying attention. My father would mention one plan for the weekend, and later my mother would describe something entirely different. My husband's explanations, once seamless, now stumbled over subtle contradictions. I noticed, catalogued, and let the details accumulate. I didn't react, I simply observed. The power of restraint gave me clarity. One evening, I found my father's phone unlocked on the counter. A message flashed across the screen, short, polite, and addressed to someone I didn't recognize. He returned to the room and smiled as if nothing had happened. I said nothing, merely turned my attention back to arranging flowers, the envelope of quiet observation in my hand. Each fragment mattered. Patterns began to emerge. The consistency of deceit became visible only when viewed across multiple small moments, not a single dramatic reveal. My husband grew more tense, though he kept a polite, composed exterior. At dinner, he answered questions with a careful precision, but I noticed the way his hand hovered over his phone, the small hesitation before he responded to anything that touched family plans or upcoming social obligations. The first moments of real doubt came when he excused himself repeatedly from conversations, leaving gaps in explanations that could not be ignored. I began to track everything meticulously: conversations, messages, schedules. I compared statements from different sources. Minor slips added up to a pattern I could no longer rationalize away. My parents' polite facades cracked in subtle ways, an eye roll barely visible, a sigh that didn't belong, words chosen too carefully. Betrayal rarely announces itself loudly. It whispers in small inconsistencies, in the hesitation between words, in the gestures that go unnoticed by anyone not looking closely. One afternoon, a friend visiting to help with the wedding noticed the tension in the room. She said nothing directly, but her glance lingered, and I felt her eyes on my parents. It was a reminder that what I observed wasn't imagined. Others could sense it too. That quiet validation strengthened my resolve to watch, to wait, to document in silence. Reacting prematurely could unravel everything. Patience, I reminded myself, was a tool. The first undeniable red flag arrived in an unexpected form. A payment confirmation appeared in my inbox, large, precise, and addressed to the gala my parents had forgotten to mention. They had made a choice, one that excluded me entirely, and now the evidence existed in digital form. My stomach tightened, but I did not confront. I did not speak. I filed it away mentally, alongside the other fragments as part of the slowly emerging picture. The betrayal was no longer subtle. It had left a trail I could follow. Even in the quiet, my mind raced. I replayed conversations, reconstructing the timeline of avoidance and omission. I observed gestures anew, the way my mother shifted in her seat when the topic of our wedding came up, the slight tension in my father's jaw, the flicker of hesitation in my husband's smile. Each micro moment now had meaning. Each silence was charged with intention. I began to feel the weight of being underestimated. No one seemed aware that I saw, that I noticed, that I understood more than I let on. That was my power, quiet as it was. Betrayal works best when it is invisible, when it thinks it is hidden. And yet here it was, revealing itself in fragments, evidence scattered like breadcrumbs. By the end of the week, I had a full mental catalog of what had been unsaid, what had been avoided, what had been manipulated. The trust I once carried effortlessly had been replaced by a quiet vigilance. I observed the gestures, the words, the patterns without confrontation, without accusation. The first red flags were clear now, waving quietly but insistently in my peripheral vision. I could not yet act. I could only wait. And in that waiting, I realized something important. Betrayal is not loud. It is quiet, methodical, and deliberate. And so too must be the response. My calm, my patience, my observation, these were not weakness. They were preparation. By the time I began to sense the full scope of what was happening, the atmosphere had shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. The inconsistencies I had cataloged no longer existed in isolation. They had become a framework of tension, a network of small betrayals that stretched across conversations, gestures, and silences. Yet when I tried to acknowledge them, even quietly to myself, the world seemed determined to erase them. It started with the casual dismissals. I would ask a question about timing or plans, phrased carefully to avoid confrontation. My mother would smile and say, "You're imagining things," as though concern or awareness were flaws to be corrected. My father would chuckle softly, adding, "You always overthink," the words lightly spoken, yet heavy in their implication. And my husband, when I noted a discrepancy between what was said and what was documented, would tilt his head, offer a patient look, and insist, "You must have misunderstood." At first, I doubted myself. That doubt was exactly what they counted on. Gaslighting is quiet, methodical, insidious. It doesn't shout. It whispers, shifts perspective, reassigns blame, and makes the observer question the very foundation of their awareness. I felt it pressing against me, a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of certainty. But I refused to surrender. I observed in silence, cataloging the patterns without outward reaction, resisting the pull to self-doubt that they hoped would ensnare me. The subtle cruelty of it began to show in more deliberate ways. A comment about my decisions, a criticism veiled as advice, a laugh that brushed off concern. It was all designed to chip away at my confidence without ever drawing attention to the action itself. When I tried to point to facts, to timelines, to evidence, I was met with smiles, soft sighs, and gentle corrections. "You're seeing ghosts," they would say. "It's not what you think." Each phrase was designed to dismiss, to invalidate, to convince me that my perception was flawed. One evening, I overheard a conversation meant to be private. My mother and father spoke in hushed tones, discussing arrangements, budgets, and priorities, carefully excluding me from decisions that directly affected me. I felt a familiar knot in my stomach, that sense of exclusion that had grown alongside my quiet observations. When I later mentioned an oddity in our schedule, my husband reassured me that I had misremembered, though the confirmation was still in my email. My trust in him wavered, but I maintained my calm, refusing to escalate. The truth was there, recorded, even if others denied it. At work, friends began to notice the strain. Casual questions about family interactions drew polite, superficial answers from me. No one could see the weight of silence I carried, the slow accumulation of contradictions and denials that pressed against the fabric of my everyday life. I observed reactions, noting which friends were perceptive, which dismissed concerns lightly, and which mirrored the behavior of those who had begun to gaslight me at home. Witnesses existed, even if unspoken. Even small tasks at home began to feel charged. Preparing invitations, arranging floral displays, checking seating charts, every movement reminded me that the people I relied upon were operating with intentions I could no longer trust. When I made small errors, intentional or not, they were magnified and reflected back as evidence of incompetence, further feeding the narrative that I was imagining problems, that my perception was unreliable. The gaslighting was surgical, targeted, and constant. I learned to speak softly, to ask questions cautiously, to observe without reacting. Each moment of dismissal, each redirection, each carefully measured correction was a signal, a marker in a map that I was drawing silently, privately. I cataloged patterns. What was said, what was avoided, what was corrected, what was amplified. Every subtle act of emotional manipulation became a record in my mind, a reference point I could return to later. By the end of the chapter, I recognized the strategy for what it was. The subtle pressure, the quiet invalidation, the reframing of facts, it was all designed to maintain control, to reinforce hierarchy, to remind me of my underestimated position. And yet, I understood the truth that they could not see. Observation, patience, and restraint were my own quiet power. I felt the rising awareness of betrayal without allowing it to consume me outwardly. I was learning to navigate a world where the very people I trusted were actively undermining that trust. The weight of being dismissed, questioned, and gaslit pressed on me daily, but I endured in silence. I cataloged, I observed, I restrained. In the quiet corners of my mind, the evidence was accumulating, and I knew that one day, the fractures they so carefully hid would no longer be invisible. The first undeniable signs of truth began arriving quietly, without fanfare. At first, it was in the form of small slips, a misdirected message left visible on my husband's laptop, an email my mother accidentally CC'd me on, a conversation my father had in the car that I hadn't meant to hear. Each fragment seemed innocuous in isolation, easily dismissed, but together they formed a thread I could follow. I remember the evening vividly. I was organizing seating arrangements, cross-referencing RSVPs and confirmations, when a notification appeared on my phone. It was a screenshot sent by a distant relative, a casual, offhand capture of my parents discussing an event I had no knowledge of. The tone was cordial, polite even, but the intent was unmistakable. They were deliberately excluding me. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, then I quietly set it aside. I did confront. I didn't need to. The evidence was already there. Later, while reviewing messages between my husband and a close friend, I noticed a pattern I had missed before. Certain details were consistently omitted, certain topics deflected, and small discrepancies between timelines became glaringly obvious. I traced them carefully, marking each instance mentally, observing without comment. These records, digital footprints, tiny witnesses to deception, were more reliable than any spoken assertion. They couldn't be gaslit or dismissed. Even the household systems began to reveal truths that had previously hidden themselves behind appearances. Calendar entries contradicted verbal assurances. Payment records reflected choices that had been carefully denied in conversation. Notes on shared devices hinted at planning that excluded me entirely. The more I observed, the clearer it became. The world around me was deliberately curated to hide their intentions. I cataloged everything, recognizing the slow, meticulous orchestration of betrayal. Witnesses, too, began to appear in subtle ways. Friends who had once been casual companions now spoke hesitantly, leaving glimpses of insight between ordinary words. "I thought it was odd," one said casually, "the way your parents handled the invitations." Another mentioned noticing my husband stepping out more frequently, his phone always in hand. They weren't trying to expose anything to me directly. They merely shared fragments that confirmed what I already suspected. I stored their observations alongside my own, building a mosaic of quiet revelation. One afternoon, I found a receipt tucked among wedding documents, small and unassuming, that confirmed a decision I had long suspected. My parents had committed to the gala, choosing it over attending my wedding. No confrontation, no announcement, just a digital imprint that silently confirmed their priorities. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. The betrayal was real, tangible, undeniable. And yet, I did nothing. I simply noted it, allowed it to exist as fact, as evidence. My calm, my restraint, remained intact. Even my husband's demeanor began to betray subtle cracks. There were fleeting hesitations, small gestures of discomfort, a slight avoidance of eye contact at times when the evidence weighed heaviest. He tried to maintain composure, but the systems, the messages, the schedules, the financial records were impartial witnesses. They could not lie. They could not be persuaded. And so, in the quiet, the truth was forming itself, independent of anyone's denials. I began to piece together timelines with meticulous attention. Conversations, digital messages, formal invitations, subtle gestures, they all aligned in a pattern I could not ignore. The exclusion was deliberate, the manipulation deliberate, and the denial consistent. Each record, each witness, each fragment of partial exposure strengthened my understanding. The betrayal was no longer hidden in shadow. It existed clearly, quietly, in plain sight, waiting for acknowledgement. By the end of the week, I had constructed a private map of the betrayal. I knew who had chosen to exclude me, who had participated in concealment, who had attempted to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Each observation was catalogued, each digital record filed in my memory. I did not act, I did not confront, and I did not speak. My awareness alone was power, quiet, restrained, and absolute. I began to feel the psychological weight of truth settling over me. The comfort I had once found in trust had been replaced by a measured understanding of deception. The realization was not dramatic, not explosive. It was methodical, precise, and irrevocable. And in that quiet understanding, I recognized a subtle reversal of power. They believed they were invisible, but I saw. They thought they controlled perception, but I observed. And observation, in silence, carries its own authority. For the first time, I allowed myself a small, private acknowledgement of the betrayal. It was real. It was deliberate. And it was mine to witness, to catalog, to carry forward without reaction. In the calm, heavy solitude of that knowledge, I understood that restraint, patience, and careful observation had brought me to a point where the truth, once partial, could no longer be ignored. The subtle revelations of the past weeks had begun to coalesce into something undeniable. The partial exposures, once fragments of doubt, had crystallized into a pattern I could follow, and now the tension in the house felt almost tangible. My parents, my husband, even the friends and acquaintances who existed at the periphery of the wedding planning seemed to sense it. The subtle shifts in behavior, the micro pauses, the fleeting glances, the careful avoidance of certain topics were no longer just background noise. They were deliberate, responsive. The escalation had begun. It started quietly, in ways that could have been dismissed by an unobservant eye. My father lingered near the door longer than usual, checking his watch repeatedly, as though rehearsing a departure he intended to make. My mother's tone, polite but tight, betrayed effort. She smiled, but there was strain behind it. My husband, who had once been a calm presence, now moved with careful precision, each gesture measured, each phrase weighed. Nothing was dramatic, nothing overt, but the subtle pressure was unmistakable. The first confrontation arrived in its most innocuous form, a scheduling conflict. A call from my mother about the gala, presented casually, as if discussing weather, revealed the depth of their deliberate exclusion. "We'll have to leave early," she said lightly, ignoring the fact that the wedding's schedule had been planned around their presence. My father added a nod, a quiet agreement that spoke volumes. I noticed, I catalogued, but I did not respond. I allowed them to speak, to commit to their actions without interruption, because every word, every choice was evidence. At home, the atmosphere thickened. Conversations became shorter, more cautious. Topics that once flowed freely were now avoided entirely, and any attempt to ask questions about family arrangements or commitments was met with polite deflection. My husband's reassurances were careful, almost rehearsed, yet I could sense the underlying tension, the slight tremor of unease in his voice. It was subtle, but it was there. He could no longer maintain the seamless facade he once had. One evening, I discovered an unintentional confirmation. A colleague had forwarded a message from my parents that had been sent to the wrong contact, detailing plans and budgets that explicitly excluded me. I read it quietly, placing it alongside other fragments in my mind. The escalation was no longer just in behavior. It was now documented, undeniable. Every slip, every misstep, every accidental exposure added weight to the reality that had been carefully hidden. The psychological pressure intensified as I observed the reactions to my quiet awareness. My parents moved more deliberately, as though attempting to mask their intentions, while my husband's attempts to maintain normalcy grew increasingly strained. Each action they took to preserve appearances only served to reveal more evidence of their priorities and alliances. The subtle power they wielded, which had once gone unchallenged, began to falter under the weight of their own exposure. I noticed the small, telling gestures, a glance exchanged between my parents when they thought I wasn't looking, a quick adjustment of their posture to project calm, a pause in conversation that seemed rehearsed. My husband, meanwhile, was increasingly aware of my observation, though he dared not acknowledge it. The tension was layered, complex, and psychologically taxing. I felt it pressing against me, a silent force demanding recognition, but I maintained my calm. Restraint was my armor, observation was my weapon. There were moments that nearly broke the surface. A whispered comment about managing the situation from my father, a fleeting sigh from my mother after a phone call, a hesitant apology from my husband for some minor oversight. Each was a subtle admission, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. I catalogued each, filing them in my mental record, letting the evidence accumulate without outward reaction. By midweek, the stakes had risen sharply. Every movement, every word, every choice was measured against the growing evidence of betrayal. My parents' exclusion of me was now undeniable, my husband's quiet complicity clear. The systems, witnesses, and records all confirmed what I had long suspected. The escalation was no longer subtle. It had become a pervasive force, threading through every interaction, every moment of my day. Even in the small routines of life, the pressure was tangible. Setting tables, organizing flowers, preparing the last details for the wedding, each action carried a weight I could not ignore. I moved deliberately, maintaining composure, observing the cracks, measuring the distance between appearances and reality. I felt the power imbalance acutely. They believed they controlled perception, yet every choice they made reinforced the evidence I had already gathered. By the end of the week, the quiet escalation had transformed into a force that dominated the household. The small deceptions, once easily dismissed, had become large enough to touch everything, to color every interaction. I had grown accustomed to observing, cataloging, and restraining my response. But the tension, now palpable, demanded acknowledgement. I had reached a point where the awareness of betrayal and the rising stakes were inseparable. And in that quiet, heavy awareness, I understood something profound. The escalation was not a sign of chaos, but of exposure. Their careful orchestration of exclusion, manipulation, and avoidance was unraveling under the weight of its own contradictions. My calm, my patience, my silent observation, these were no longer passive acts. They were a quiet power, one that would shape the inevitable consequences to come. The truth, once partial and fragmented, had now settled into an undeniable weight. The threads of betrayal I had been tracing for weeks had woven themselves into a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Every message, every action, every subtle omission confirmed what my instincts had long suspected. My parents had chosen the Gala over me, and my husband, despite his calm exterior, had silently permitted it. The realization pressed against me, cold and persistent, yet I remained outwardly still. That night I sat alone in the dim light of our living room. The wedding preparations had reached their final stages, and the house hummed with quiet activity, vendors arriving, friends checking details, flowers being arranged with precision. But beneath the surface, a tension clung to me, an invisible pressure that made the familiar feel foreign. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the silence stretch. No one suspected how acutely I understood what had been done and why. No one guessed that I carried the pattern of their deception in the quiet corners of my mind. The breaking point was not explosive. It did not arrive in confrontation or accusation. It arrived in observation, in recognition, in the quiet acceptance of reality. I realized with a sharp clarity that the people I had trusted most, my parents, my husband, were complicit in a betrayal that could not be undone. My trust had been methodically dismantled, replaced with a careful facade of politeness and calm, while the true priorities had been hidden beneath layers of omission. I thought of the countless small moments, my mother's fleeting hesitation, my father's careful avoidance, the messages my husband had allowed to slip through unchallenged. Each fragment was now a record, a witness to their choices. The awareness brought with it a psychological cost, a low, persistent ache that settled in the chest, a knot that refused to unwind. And yet, despite the weight, I chose restraint. I would not allow the raw force of anger or despair to dictate action. Restraint had been my tool, and it would remain so. The emotional toll was significant. I felt the sting of exclusion, the sharp edge of being undervalued, the quiet erosion of trust I had once carried effortlessly. I grieved in silence, without outward expression, without spectacle. My mind catalogued not only the betrayal itself, but the consequences of reaction. Confrontation might reveal the truth, yes, but it would also give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement, a platform to argue, to manipulate, to distort. I refused to grant that. I held my composure, internalized the hurt, and let it settle into a measured, deliberate awareness. The moral weight was heavier still. I understood now the complexity of human choice, the fragility of loyalty, the ease with which trust could be manipulated. My parents' decision to attend the gala was a deliberate prioritization, and my husband's silence was a tacit agreement. There was no justification that could erase the reality. And yet, I recognized that the world demanded navigation rather than retaliation. The breaking point, then, was not a moment of action. It was the conscious decision to carry the knowledge without allowing it to dictate chaos. I moved through the days with deliberate calm, observing and cataloging, letting each fragment of truth solidify into understanding. Friends and helpers, unaware of the full extent, offered casual support and small reassurances. I accepted them politely, but internally, the awareness of betrayal ever present, guiding my actions without dictating them. Each movement, each smile, each nod was measured. I did not accuse. I did not argue. I did not flinch. I recorded silently with precision. By the end of this period, I felt the psychological cost clearly. Sleep was restless. Moments of quiet reflection carried a sharp tension. Yet within this tension was clarity. I had reached the emotional breaking point not by capitulating, but by acknowledging. I had accepted the betrayal for what it was, recognized the consequences of exposure, and chosen restraint over reaction. That choice was not weakness. It was deliberate, measured, and powerful in its quietness. The realization settled heavily. Some truths exist to be witnessed, not to be celebrated. Some betrayals demand endurance, not action. And some power lies not in confrontation, but in observation, in the careful accumulation of understanding. I had reached a point where I could no longer ignore what had been done, yet I also knew that responding openly would not serve clarity. It would only scatter the delicate records I had gathered. So I held still. I carried the weight of awareness, cataloged every omission, every lie, every subtle act of exclusion. I observed the cracks in behavior, the unintended admissions, the tiny markers of guilt. And in the calm, heavy silence, I recognized a quiet power that no one else could see. I had arrived at the moral and emotional breaking point, not through outward loss, but through inward clarity. I understood now that the cost of truth is heavy, and the cost of restraint is heavier. Yet restraint preserves clarity. Restraint allows observation to become authority, quiet as it may be. And in that understanding, I found a fragile, resolute strength, a power born not of action or confrontation, but of patient, deliberate endurance. The aftermath of realization carried its own weight, heavier than I had anticipated. The patterns I had traced, the fragments I had cataloged, the quiet observations I had accumulated, they began to assert themselves in subtle, inevitable ways. Truth, once partial, had become undeniable, and its consequences reached those who had believed they could control perception. The world had shifted around them, quietly, inexorably, in ways they neither anticipated nor could undo. The first indications appeared in small interactions. My parents, who had treated the gala as their priority, suddenly found themselves navigating a landscape of subtle social disapproval. Friends who had been peripheral observers now spoke differently, casually acknowledging the wedding without needing explicit explanation. Their polite smiles could no longer mask recognition. Their choices, once carefully hidden, were now visible to the network of witnesses who had been quietly observing all along. My husband felt the weight too, though in quieter ways. He had participated in the orchestration of exclusion, had permitted the silence and omission that reinforced my parents' prioritization. Now, as the evidence became increasingly undeniable, he found that the subtle cracks he had hoped to mask were obvious to anyone paying attention. The tension in his measured movements, the slight hesitations, the micro-expressions of discomfort, all of it reflected the cost of complicity. Even within the family, the consequences manifested in restrained ways. Invitations meant for my parents' social circle were delivered with a polite but unmistakable acknowledgement of absence, revealing the truth of their decision without direct confrontation. Conversations that had once flowed around them now subtly exposed the choices they had made. The systems, witnesses, and records I had carefully observed had begun to exert quiet influence, enforcing a kind of accountability without spectacle. I watched quietly as the patterns I had traced became undeniable. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouted accusations, no public humiliation. The consequences were calm, measured, and relentless precisely because they were grounded in fact. Digital records, shared communications, and witnesses, small but persistent, ensured that the betrayal could no longer be denied. My parents' prioritization of the gala over my wedding was clear to those who needed to know, and my husband's silent compliance was equally visible. In private moments, I observed the subtle ways guilt began to shape behavior. My mother's tone carried more weight, her polite laughter tinged with self-consciousness. My father's gestures, once casual, were now careful, deliberate, as though each movement required calibration. My husband's reassurance of calm now felt hollow, unconvincing, under the quiet scrutiny of truth. These were not punishments I had administered, not actions I had orchestrated. They were consequences arising naturally from the exposure of hidden choices. Even the extended circle of friends and acquaintances began to recognize the implications. Observations that had once been subtle were now reinforced through indirect communication. Shared stories, quiet acknowledgement of absence, references to decisions that had been concealed. The social fabric responded to truth, not rumor, and the patterns of betrayal that had been invisible for so long now reverberated outward in a controlled, inevitable manner. I maintained my calm throughout. I did not intervene to highlight these consequences, did not leverage the evidence to punish or lecture. My silence, my observation, and my restraint allowed the systems to assert themselves. The truth had power precisely because it was quiet and unassailable. Each record, each witness, each fragment of partial exposure that I had noted now enforced its own authority, ensuring that accountability unfolded naturally, without spectacle. By the end of the week, the quiet consequences had settled into place. My parents, my husband, and all who had participated in omission or exclusion were aware, even if they refused to admit it openly. Their positions had shifted, subtly but irreversibly, under the weight of their own choices and the documentation that could not be contested. I carried no triumph, no satisfaction, only the sober recognition that truth, once acknowledged, shapes reality even without direct action. In the quiet spaces of the evening, I reflected on the cost. Betrayal had been real. Complicity had been present. And yet, through observation, restraint, and patient documentation, I had ensured that the truth could no longer be denied. The consequences were calm, understated, and pervasive. There was no drama, no spectacle, no vindication. Only the steady, unyielding reality of truth and the subtle shifts it produced in those who had once believed themselves untouchable.